Tell me, who do you think was the best Roman? The name that springs to mind first may be Julius Caesar, and that is unsurprising. Caesar was certainly a great man, but he also broke the Roman Republic irreparably. The greatest Roman is something different from the best Roman. Others may say Augustus. This is another common choice, but we run into many of the same pitfalls as we would with Caesar. Augustus and Mark Antony ran a murderous campaign to snuff out their rivals when they had seized power, for example. Both of these are great men, but are not counted among the best Rome had to offer. For many people, one of the last names they would think of, if they even thought of it at all, would be Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. This is a man who rivals Cincinnatus and may even surpass Cicero as the best Roman of them all. Africanus was a peerless general who rescued the Roman Republic from Hannibal Barca, its most dangerous foreign enemy during the Second Punic Wars from 212 to 201 BC, and a strong politician who was perhaps the most virtuous to ever grace the streets of Rome. So why has he been almost forgotten by history? This is a question posed by BH Liddell Hart in his Biography, and one we will return to later on. For now, I will examine Liddell Hart's biography entitled Scipio Africanus, Greater Than Napoleon. This review is broken into 4 parts: content, readability, personal enjoyment, and final recommendation. Content. B.H. Liddell Hart was a very strong historian who died in 1970. He turns his attention to the tragically understudied Scipio Africanus in this volume and fills it with powerful content drawing from ancient sources, primarily Livy and Polybius, whom he quotes frequently throughout the text. It turns out that though Hannibal is remembered so fondly by history even today, the man who surpassed and conquered him on the battlefield had most of his life detailed out by only a couple of ancient sources, the ones we mentioned above. In addition, Africanus wrote his memoirs in Greek, a rarity at this period in Roman history, but they have been lost, as has Plutarch's parallel lives biography of Africanus. We know very little about his wife Aemilia, and little about his personal life. With so few sources, how does one go about putting together a proper biography? No doubt this was a challenge for Liddell Hart, but there was enough material available for him to produce a strong work on Africanus due to the author's understanding of military matters and his tenacious attention to the small details in the historical record. B.H. Liddell Hart was no armchair military historian. He served in the Great War for the British and was wounded numerous times in the Battle of the Somme. This was a man who lived through hellish conditions that, when combined with his above-average intelligence, cultivated within him something most university-educated scholars and historians today lack: a unique understanding of combat and the men who take part in it. And Scipio Africanus was a man of combat. Liddell Hart writes a stirring account of Africanus as he campaigned throughout Hispania, starting with a surprise attack on and capture of Carthago Nova, and continuing through a number of military and diplomatic triumphs. As Liddell Hart reminds us throughout the text, Africanus was no mere one-dimensional warlord. This was a man with a keen mind who understood the importance of diplomacy while on campaign. Some of his most impressive actions in Hispania involved winning over local tribes who would ally with and support the Romans as they sought to drive Carthage from the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, Liddell Hart provides us with ample evidence Africanus could be considered a virtuous general. For example, when Carthago Nova fell to the cunning of the Roman general, his men began what so many other ancient armies did: to massacre the population and search for plunder. Africanus walked through the town for a short while as this went on, then issued a command, and the pillaging ceased immediately. From there, Africanus declared that the captured men of Carthago Nova, about 10,000 in number, to be freed, and he restored their property to them. The 2,000 artisans of Carthago Nova were enslaved, but Africanus gave his word that each would be freed upon the defeat of Carthage if they gave their full effort to the Roman cause. It is clear the purpose of the initial and short-lived rampage was to ensure the population understood the magnanimity of Africanus's behavior. This was in stark contrast to Hannibal's behavior in Saguntum, less than a decade earlier and 300 miles away, where the entire town was put to the sword when they refused to vacate their homes after their defenses were overrun by Hannibal's Carthaginian troops. Liddell Hart makes certain we understand how unusual Africanus's behavior was for his time, even if our modern sensibilities tell us to spare civilians in war. It would be easy to write this biography starting with Carthago Nova and concluding with the Battle of Zama, where Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal, broke Carthaginian power forever, and earned his agnomen. Liddell Hart, however, does not take the easy way out. A significant part of this book takes place after Zama. We learn that the Roman people attempted to bestow countless honors on Africanus, including Consul for Life and Dictator, but were rebuffed by their heroic general. The man who had saved Rome in her darkest hour had now set his sights on saving her virtue. We will return to this subject a little later on in the review. The content within Scipio Africanus, greater than Napoleon, is of the highest quality. Barring an archaeological find that sheds more light on Africanus's life, this book contains every bit of information we can be certain of, while making well-educated guesses about the things we cannot know for sure. All of it is woven together by a master historian who has a visceral understanding of war and the men who fight it. It should be no surprise that I rank content a 5 out of 5. Readability. Biographies can be challenging for the average person. Sometimes the subject is of some interest, but the author chooses to relate every minor detail in the protagonist's existence, the result being a bloated, boring slog through an otherwise interesting individual's life. Other times, the author decides to spend much of the text speculating about their subject and doesn't give us enough verified facts. This leads to the feeling we are reading a lengthy tabloid instead of coming to understand why someone lived the way they did. And then there are condensed biographies that leave out so much vital information, we feel as though the author did little more than skim a Wikipedia entry. BH Liddell Hart manages to avoid each of these traps and provides us with a generally readable document. Each of Scipio Africanus's battles are detailed out, and maps are often provided to help the reader visualize troop movements. Liddell Hart spends just enough time on every engagement and explains why each was a well-orchestrated success. I am not a military man, but I found the descriptions to be clear enough and provided just enough detail to expand my knowledge of why the tactics were successful, but not so much that it bogged down the narrative. Liddell Hart was a very educated and intelligent man, so this is not a book that can be read by everyone equally. In order to get the most out of this text, the reader should be familiar with major figures in military history, both ancient and modern. It is not required, but it is a minor barrier to entry. For example, I'm familiar with Gustavus Adolphus, or the Lion of the North of Sweden, though I am not an expert on his life or legacy. Even though my knowledge of the lion is limited, I understood the comparison Liddell Hart made between Scipio's invasion of Africa and Adolphus's invasion of mainland Europe. There is a whole chapter entitled Rome's Zenith, which compares Africanus quite favorably to other ancient and modern generals. Overall, I felt Liddell Hart's biography was readable, but I think it will pose some challenges to those who do not read biographies often or are unfamiliar with ancient Rome. Also, it is important to realize Liddell Hart was a very learned man, and as such he has a sophisticated writing style which may pose additional challenges for some readers. I rank readability a 3 out of 5. Personal enjoyment. As a disclaimer here, this section is meant to indicate the amount of enjoyment the average person will experience reading this book, not my own. It is at this point in our review that we return to the later life of Scipio Africanus and his quest to save the virtue of Rome. After Zama, and after declining all the honors that the citizens of Rome offered him, Africanus was elected a censor. I do not believe the average person knows much about what a Roman censor did up until the time Sulla abolished the office, so I shall explain using the words of Cicero. The censors are to determine the generations, origins, families, and properties of the people. They are to watch over and protect the city's temples, roads, waters, treasury, and taxes. They are to divide the people into 3 parts. Next, they are to allow or approve the properties, generations, and ranks of the people. They are to describe the offspring of knights and foot soldiers. They are to forbid being unmarried. They are to guide the behavior of the people. They are not to overlook abuse in the Senate. As you can see, this is not a minor position, even if it is lesser known today than the emperors and consuls. And it was a perfect position for a man like Africanus. While much of this period of Roman history has been lost, we do know the time during which Africanus and his co-censor served was marked by an unusual level of harmony and no morality punishments. It seemed as though the great general had achieved his goal in re-establishing virtue in the streets of Rome, and so he retired from politics to a quiet life. Even though he spent years outside public life, he was still a man whom the Roman people loved. Suddenly, the harmony and peacefulness within Rome was disturbed by rumblings of another war with Carthage, and Rome's enemy had a potential new ally, Syria. Africanus was called to stand for Rome once more. He sailed for Carthage as a diplomat, and discovered his old adversaries were in no condition to fight. But the Syrians were another matter. This time, however, he demonstrated how small an ego he had for such a great man. Africanus allowed his brother Lucius to command the army, and he went along as a mere lieutenant. There is no doubt that Africanus used his considerable diplomatic skills and strategic vision to ensure Roman victory. Despite this, Lucius decided he would be called Asiaticus for conquering Asia, and ensured his own triumph was larger to the one given to Africanus when the latter returned from defeating Hannibal and the Carthaginians. So what does all that have to do with personal enjoyment? Let's examine that for a moment. It is good for one's spirit to read about great men, particularly great men who possessed a sum of qualities that any human being could aspire to. Scipio Africanus is one of those men. He could have held unlimited power, but he gave it up to retire to a private life. While Liddell Hart does not explicitly call this out, George Washington did the same many centuries later. We enjoy seeing great men possess a selflessness that is so often unique among men, great or not. When his brother let his jealousy of Africanus's titanic accomplishments drive him to arrogantly proclaim himself Asiaticus and act as if a victory over a lesser foe was to be celebrated as an amazing accomplishment, Scipio Africanus chose silence instead of bickering. Who hasn't had a spat with a family member? We can understand and appreciate how difficult the situation must have been for Africanus, and enjoy seeing the man allow his brother his time of glory. I think it is clear to see that Africanus often led by example. In this biography, he comes across as a human being. His examples may be a bit too high for some to strive for, and some may not care for reading so much about Rome or military matters. But I believe the majority will enjoy reading about Scipio Africanus, the man. I rank personal enjoyment a 4 out of 5. Final recommendation. Scipio Africanus, Greater Than Napoleon, was originally published in 1926. It was very interesting to see BH Liddell Hart make comments that, reading a bit between the lines, demonstrates he was concerned about the state of Europe at the time of writing. The reader has a benefit of hindsight, but it was hard not to get the impression Liddell Hart had some foresight that the next great war was coming, and as I understand it, in this regard, he was not in the majority among intellectuals of the former Allied powers. Perhaps this is one of the things that caused Liddell Hart to be drawn to Africanus at this time. Both men had the vision to see the challenges that were coming. Perhaps that's why this book was written. Liddell Hart provided his people with the biography of the kind of man that would be necessary to defeat a newly risen Germany or Russian menace, while Africanus correctly realized the greatest enemy to Rome was the Roman people themselves. Eventually, lesser men got tired of seeing the gleaming reputation of Africanus and attempted to bring him down. Cato and those who believed as he did also felt some measure of anger towards Africanus, who was now in the last years of his life. It is very difficult for petty men to be in the company of greatness. But Africanus was still beloved by the Roman people, and he had retired from public life, so the Senate decided to attack him by attacking his brother. They claimed Lucius misappropriated 4 million sesterces and demanded to see the accounting books. Africanus, in turn, was enraged by this behavior and proceeded to tear the books to pieces and hurl them on the floor of the Senate. Interesting, is it not, that even though his brother behaved inappropriately towards him, Africanus protected him when he needed it. As Liddell Hart put it, the action was unwise, but very human. Of course, this was exactly what Cato and the Senate wanted. They put Africanus on trial. During this time, and in retort to what was likely an outrageous statement, Africanus said, "It ill became the Roman people to listen to accusations against Publius Cornelius Scipio, to whom his accusers owe it that they have the power of speech at all." Arrogant, perhaps, but on the mark. However, public sentiment was turning against Africanus and his brother. Ancient Rome is much like today. Keep dragging a man's name through the mud, and eventually some of it will stick, even if it is not deserved. Eventually, Africanus went into voluntary exile at Liternum and died in 183 BC. He had no interest in returning to the ungrateful people whom he had saved. The Roman people uncovered his innocence after his death and angrily turned upon the men who deceived them into believing Scipio Africanus was so flawed. One hopes Charon brought news of vindication across the river Styx to Africanus and put his soul to rest. He deserved that much. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Truly a great life and an exceptional man. So we go back to the question from the very beginning of this review. Why has Scipio Africanus been nearly forgotten by history? After consuming this book, I think the answer is relatively simple. Africanus was the best Rome had to offer, and by attempting to preserve the virtue of the Roman people, those lacking in virtue knew they had no choice but to erase what they could. They hacked away at his reputation at the end of his life, and in death they chose to bury the memory of a man who so few could ever live up to. Greatness is never truly forgotten, however, and so his legacy is still with us. And to be fair, there were some who kept that memory alive. Not many throughout the slow death of the Republic or the slower decay of the Empire, but enough that one can learn of Africanus if he knows where to look. This is a man who should be studied in depth and spoken of regularly today. It is a tragedy that mankind cannot produce another Scipio Africanus when the world so needs him. As for BH Liddell Hart, he should be commended for reminding us of this titan of the Roman Republic and writing a biography that is worthy of the man. My final recommendation is a 5 out of 5. What's next? We're going to mix things up for the next review, and I'm going to cover one of the great courses. This one is The Decisive Battles of World History by Gregory S. Eldreddy. I look forward to sharing that review with you soon. I've finished a half dozen or so of great courses, and I may do a few others if this next review turns out well. I was also fortunate enough to receive a review copy of Quintus Curtius's newest book, entitled Sallust, The Conspiracy of Catiline and the War of Jugurtha. You can look forward to that review once I have developed a video that can do it justice. The plan is to have it out in 3 or 4 weeks. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.